One of the most notable underappreciated DC heroes is Billy Batson as Shazam, or Captain Marvel, or the Captain, sometimes referred to as the Big Red Cheese. He's been a part of comic book history for almost as long as Superman, but the average person doesn't really know about his significance due to the character's lack of exposure or mistreatment by DC and outside media. There have been periods when DC editorial lacked a clear direction for Shazam and didn't know what to do with him, as well as times when studio executives didn't care enough to incorporate basic elements of his mythos that fans were anticipating, even going as far as to make a number of false promises. I think his presence can effectively give more attention to the magic side of the DC universe, regardless of what adaptation or universe he's in. A mainstream adaptation that isn't hindered by studio interference or behind the scenes egos that don't care about the source material will do wonders for showcasing the whimsical, almost fantasy-like nature of Shazam and his family, allowing the character to stand apart instead of being viewed as a Superman knockoff. Captain Marvel was created under Fawcett Comics in late 1939, as Fawcett Publications created their own comics division with their own lineup of superheroes. The Marvel family in the 1940s had the best-selling comics at the time, outselling the likes of Superman and Batman. The best-selling comic in 1944 was Captain Marvel Adventures, selling more than 14 million copies that year. Captain Marvel provided the groundwork for many concepts that would be used in mainstream comics, such as having a family of superheroes, a girl sidekick, quickly changing identities through magic, and having a young boy with superpowers.
He is often considered to be just another version of Superman, but there's so much more to it than that. The very tropes of saying a magic word and becoming something else, or having sort of an electrical transformation where a lightning bolt comes down and poof, you're suddenly another thing. That was Captain Marvel's gift to the creative landscape, and then countless other well-known characters and many unknown characters copied it verbatim.
Captain Marvel became the very first superhero to appear in a movie with the 12-chapter black and white serial titled Adventures of Captain Marvel, which was released in 1941. The amount of promotion and merchandising that was done for the character peaked around the mid-1970s to early 80s. He had a live-action TV show that debuted in 1974 and a cartoon in 1981. One of the aspects of the character that resonated with young readers was his pure sense of morality and goodness, combined with a grand sense of fantasy. Billy Batson still aimed to do good despite the difficult circumstances he grew up in prior to meeting the wizard Shazam. In some iterations, like in the original Fawcett comics and parts of Post-Crisis, Billy lived in a subway station or an abandoned apartment building. In other versions, some writers have him living alone in a one-bedroom apartment after his parents die, after getting kicked out by his uncle who was supposed to be his legal guardian. In the New 52, Billy struggled settling in and moved from foster home to foster home. A well-known detail of Shazam's publication history is the legal troubles between Fawcett and DC Comics, which was officially known as National Comics Publication at the time. They sued Fawcett Comics for copyright infringement in 1941, as they believed Captain Marvel was just a ripoff of Superman. Their main argument was that Captain Marvel was a clone of Superman in terms of his costume, powers, and storylines. The whole ordeal went to trial in 1948, and the initial verdict went in Fawcett's favor, as lawyers pointed out that National hadn't put a copyright on their Superman newspaper comic strips, so their grievances weren't valid. However, National appealed the decision in 1951 and got a new trial in 1953, where a new judge ruled that Captain Marvel infringed on Superman's copyright. Fawcett decided it wasn't worth the fight with the sharp decline in comic sales in the 50s, resulting in both parties settling out of court. Fawcett ended up paying $400,000 in damages and agreed to never publish Captain Marvel again. DC Comics began to license the Fawcett superheroes in 1972 and decided to publish a new Captain Marvel title the following year, but they couldn't use the name Captain Marvel on the cover because Marvel Comics trademarked the name in 1967, so the book was just now titled Shazam. However, the character himself was still called Captain Marvel. He wouldn't officially change his hero name to Shazam until the New 52 in 2011. DC finally purchased and obtained the full ownership of the character in 1991, so it seemed like on the comics side, the character could be used without any restrictions. But for a time, the creatives behind the Justice League animated show couldn't use Captain Marvel or any characters related to him due to the rights not being available to them. He was originally going to appear in the episode Hereafter, where Superman was presumed dead, but his role ended up being replaced with Lobo. The creative team would eventually gain permission to use Captain Marvel in Justice League Unlimited, making his debut in the episode Clash. Over the years, there have been a few attempts to get an animated series centered on Shazam off the ground, but they proved to be unsuccessful. Alex Ross and Paul Dini pitched a Captain Marvel animated series to Cartoon Network, but things didn't work out because of the complicated nature of the character's animation rights. The drawing Alex Ross made was a mixture of Bruce Timm's art style and the simplicity of the Powerpuff Girls. Matt Koffenberg was asked to draw concepts for another Shazam cartoon being pitched to Warner Brothers, but nothing ever came out of it. Jake Castanero also created artwork for a separate animated Shazam project back in 2018, but that ultimately didn't go anywhere either. Since the Crisis on Infinite Earths reboot, Shazam has never really had the chance to establish a solid foundation that could be built upon over a prolonged period of time before another inevitable relaunch or reboot. He got a 4-issue miniseries in 1987 that cemented the hero in the New Earth continuity created after Crisis and featured his new mainline origin. But there wouldn't be any prominent Shazam stories afterwards until 1994, where DC began to reboot the character again with a new graphic novel, which turned into an ongoing series in 1995, ignoring the previous miniseries and providing another new origin. The Power of Shazam series was met with decent sales and was well received, but it got cancelled by DC after 47 issues because they saw it as a losing effort. He would go on to have a few miniseries here and there, as well as appearing in team-up books like JSA and Justice League International. The New 52 brought forth yet another reboot, which is what the DCEU took inspiration from, but he never got a proper solo series during that time. The character's stories were mainly in the backup issues of the main Justice League title. He would eventually join the Justice League during the events of Forever Evil. During the Rebirth era, Shazam had an ongoing series that lasted only 15 issues. Later on, leading into the Infinite Frontier era and the present day, he had a couple of miniseries and an ongoing series that was cancelled in 2025 after only lasting 21 issues. Shazam has been used sparingly throughout the decades since the 70s. He's been done dirty in a few adaptations, but the DC Extended Universe is probably the biggest example of how much they fumbled the character toward the end of that universe's lifespan. Now, his initial entry into the universe wasn't bad. The 2019 Shazam film was well received by critics and audiences, and considered to be one of the standouts amongst the catalog of interconnected live-action DC movies at the time. It was one of the first entries in Warner Brothers' new approach to the DCEU after Justice League, which was to focus less on the connective threads of the universe and more on standalone projects. It had a relatively smaller production budget compared to the other DCEU movies, coming in at around $90 to $100 million, making it one of the least expensive films in the franchise. This allowed the movie to make decent profits with a worldwide box office gross of around $365 million. The cracks really started to form with the release of the Black Adam movie. The Rock was moving around like he was about to be the next Kevin Feige for the DC universe, talking about some Black Adam will serve as our phase 1 of storytelling in our DC universe. Under no circumstance should you be spending more than $100 million on a movie centered around Teth Adam. Like, what are we doing? I don't mind the idea of making a movie on a DC villain or anti-hero, as The Rock likes to refer to him in this movie, but spending over $200 million on someone who isn't a heavy hitter and is like a C-lister at best is just ridiculous. The movie initially had a budget of $190 million, but because of a poor test screening, they decided to partake in 20 days worth of reshoots, inflating the production budget to around $260 million.
Which just finished reshooting its reshoots, making it the most expensive TV show ever. So it's gotta be good, am I right?
Y'all remember when The Rock was coping and trying to gaslight people into believing that the movie actually made a profit? You just gotta love the false equivalency of trying to compare Black Adam's performance to that of Captain America: The First Avenger. Buddy, The First Avenger didn't have a $260 million budget. It came out at a time when cinematic universes were still a relatively new concept, releasing only a few years into the conception of the MCU. Black Adam released almost a decade into the DCEU's existence, and the general audience had already checked out by that point. I don't think the movie was awful. It's a pretty mundane superhero movie, but I do think it deserves to be clowned on a bit given the fact that The Rock's desires and agenda to spearhead the DC universe hindered the potential of the Shazam franchise in live action. One of the biggest fumbles with the DCEU is how Shazam and Black Adam never once interacted or fought one another. Teth Adam is literally the most prolific Shazam villain. It's not even close. Imagine if the 2016 Suicide Squad movie never happened and Jared Leto's Joker got his own movie. But instead of setting up an inevitable encounter with Batman, he wants to fight Green Arrow in Star City. Like, bro, that's not your man's. It's funny how the generic CGI villain that the Justice Society and Black Adam fight during the third act of the movie, Sabak, is yet another Shazam villain who never actually interacted with Billy Batson or his family. He's a direct counter to Shazam due to being powered by 6 demons that spell out the acronym of his name instead of gods. My problem is that when it comes to the intentions of the producers and Dwayne Johnson himself, pondering on the idea of Black Adam going head to head with Shazam wasn't based around the fact that he's his biggest villain in the source material. It was merely because Shazam was one of the strongest characters in the DCEU alongside Wonder Woman and Superman. They had this fascination of trying to cement Black Adam as this powerhouse by having him go up against characters who would be considered a tough matchup.
Now what you're going to see here is why the hierarchy of power in the DC universe is about to change.
Are you sure?
Now, a lot of people would say that the underperformance of the DCEU movies that came out in 2023, those being Shazam: Fury of the Gods, The Flash, Blue Beetle, and Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom, was largely due to James Gunn announcing his reboot plans and the Gods and Monsters slate prior to the release of those 4 entries. While I do agree that it was a contributing factor, I don't think it was the sole reason. I honestly believe that even if James Gunn had waited until after The Flash or the end of 2023, those movies still wouldn't have done that well in theaters. The general audience by that point had already lost interest in that universe, with entries like Wonder Woman 1984 and Black Adam not really doing anything to regain audience intrigue. You could see the box office of the DCEU films decline after the release of the first Aquaman movie. Movies like The Suicide Squad had decent reviews, but it came out during the pandemic and was also made available on streaming the same day it hit theaters. While the first Shazam had decent reviews, it didn't seem like there was this grand enthusiasm for a second installment. Not to mention, the sequel's reception paled in comparison to the first one. Even though the first Shazam was a success, its box office was significantly smaller than the DCEU movies that came out prior, and this was around the peak of superhero movie interest. Fury of the Gods on its own just wasn't all that remarkable. For starters, instead of following up with Mr. Mind from the mid-credits scene of the first movie, or using any Shazam villain from the comics, they came up with these generic original characters to serve as the main antagonists, those being the Daughters of Atlas. During the pre-crisis era of DC and during the Fawcett comic publications, Captain Marvel and Billy Batson were 2 separate entities with distinct personalities, whereas in post-crisis, his adult form still maintained Billy's personality, which I think is fine, and I don't mind seeing Billy's sort of childlike innocence in adult form, but the way Zachary Levi's adult version acted more childish than Astra Angel's Billy Batson started to become more noticeable in the second movie. In the first movie, I think the dichotomy was demonstrated well and still stayed true to what was shown of Billy's character up until he met the wizard Shazam. I can understand this idea of Billy acting more carefree and like himself in adult form, as he usually puts up a barrier to not get too attached to others in his kid form.
Dude, I like you like this. This is so cool. Like at first you were kind of like the opposite of how Darla is.
A dick?
Your words, not mine.
But in Fury of the Gods, 4 years have gone by and this dude is almost 18 years old. Yet Zachary Levi's portrayal plays on the immaturity even more. I can understand Billy feeling more carefree and confident, but his IQ shouldn't also drop by like 50 points.
If I may point out one of the powers that may be MIA.
Are you very unsubtly implying that I somehow lack the wisdom of Solo Man?
There is no compromise. I knew you were gonna say that. Wisdom of Saruman. Don't mess with me. Okay. So he's an idiot.
Yeah.
Before and after the release of Black Adam, The Rock constantly reassured fans that a crossover between his character and Shazam would happen, and the studio thought it'd be best to develop each character with their own solo movie before having them face off.
In one script, and it was just a mush of, just put them both together because they're both connected. So that's when I said, we can't do it like this. We have to respect Shazam and his origin story. And that has to be his own movie. Respect Black Adam. This has to be his own movie. Build them up, and then they can do this.
I'm waiting for the crossover. And
oh, the crossovers, yeah, they're gonna happen.
So that was a fucking lie.
Even if this was the genuine plan, we know it wasn't a top priority because the Black Adam sequel would have just been more set up for the showdown against Superman. I find it funny whenever he talks about wanting Shazam and Black Adam to eventually cross over, while also actively prohibiting the connective threads between those characters behind the scenes. There was supposed to be a post-credit scene in Black Adam where the Justice Society would have recruited Shazam into the team, but The Rock vetoed against it. So Peter Safran at the time wanted to use that scene as a mid-credit scene for Fury of the Gods. But then The Rock didn't want any of the JSA actors to appear, resulting in Amelia Harcourt and John Economos from Peacemaker Season 1 trying to recruit Shazam instead. A lot of people thought it was James Gunn trying to force his characters into the wider universe, but he actually had nothing to do with putting Harcourt and Economos in the movie. Harcourt and Amanda Waller were also in Black Adam. Gunn didn't get control of the newly formed DC Studios until after those movies were already shot and made. He actually disliked the fact that they were in those movies to begin with. It's pretty weird because in James Gunn's DCU, Harcourt lost her job at Argus and Amanda Waller blacklisted her from every agency after Waller's daughter Adebayo exposed her operations at the end of Peacemaker Season 1. But I guess in the DCEU's continuity, Waller just didn't care and allowed Harcourt to continue working under her. You can tell they didn't care much for Shazam by allowing The Rock to do whatever he wanted and sacrificing basic lore just for the sake of ego. If the plan was for Superman and Shazam to team up to fight Black Adam like in the Superman Shazam The Return of Black Adam DC showcase, then fine, whatever. But I think we can infer that wasn't his true desire. They willfully gave the power to someone who had no care for the source material for a brief period, and we all know how well that turned out.
There's no one on this planet that can stop me.
The Gun said otherwise.
Bang, 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 bang!
Because of that whole ordeal, don't expect Shazam to pop up in a live-action project anytime soon. Outside of that medium, he hasn't really been given a whole lot of exposure or more specifically a major role. There have been a handful of decent depictions where he has smaller roles like in Young Justice Season 1, that one episode of JLU, the DC showcase mentioned earlier, Superman Batman Apocalypse, and many others. The Superman and Shazam team-up showcase is the closest he's ever gotten to a solo animated project in modern times, which is only about 22 minutes in length. In the DC animated movie universe, Shazam was part of the original 7 members of the Justice League, replacing Aquaman from the New 52 lineup before the Throne of Atlantis movie. Sadly, he got relegated to being another background character after that movie, never playing a prominent role in future installments or getting an entry of his own. He also became part of the catalog of characters who died unceremoniously in Apocalypse War. The most prolific adaptation that did him dirty was the Injustice Gods Among Us game. The Injustice universe is probably the biggest case of nerfing a character like Shazam just to prop up another character. I don't think it's necessarily an issue if you want Superman to be the strongest guy in the room, but the way he was able to handle Shazam so easily makes it seem like he was leagues below Superman, if something as simple as heat vision was all it took. I mean, it's not like the character was historically known for being around Superman's power level, and whose original comic company literally got sued for having too many similarities to the Man of Steel. The prequel comic that came out afterwards cemented multiple times that he might be one of the only few heroes who could combat Superman, and only stayed in the regime to keep him in check, but whatever. Since it's probably gonna be a minute before we see Billy Batson in a live action setting, because of how poorly Fury of the Gods performed in theaters, I think a cool way to give him the spotlight would be through an animated series, considering he hasn't gotten one since the 80s. It'd be a cool way to reintroduce the character into the DCU. Have it set in the fictional location of Fawcett City, where the character and his mythos originated, instead of having his story set in Philadelphia like in the New 52 and the DCEU. Major cities like New York City and Los Angeles don't exist in the DCU, and the world instead consists of a different map made up of fictional locations from DC Comics. It'd be a lot easier to avoid the problem of the child actor playing Billy Batson growing up too quickly, while also maintaining consistency between the two identities. It would also make it easier to adapt some of the wackier elements tied to his supporting cast, like Talkie Tawny, as well as villains who never got their proper due, like Mr. Mind. One could only hope that a future installment can delve more into the character's rich history and significance. If the goal is to prop up lesser known heroes alongside the heavy hitters, Shazam could provide a strong entry point that appeals to all audiences while also bringing attention to comic book elements that many directors and creatives seem to shy away from, because there's a lot of potential being left on the table.